Now I want to look at how this writer goes about using information from a source. First thing that I want to point out is that the reference to a source, it's not like a one and done proposition. We don't just have one sentence where the writer, drops an idea from a source into the paper and then moves on. You've got one sentence, two sentences, three sentences, four sentences, five sentences that this writer spends helping the reader um, hear about and understand and interpret the information from this source. So let's break it down a little bit. Um, Obviously, the writer has identified some information from Tugin's source to include in this paper. And let's see how this writer does introducing this source. Let's take a look at this first sentence. What you have in this sentence is the name of the publication where this article appears, the writer, and the title. It's a good idea to mention the publication in this instance because it's letting us know that this piece appears in a well-respected, nationally known publication. Now, I will say the title of the New York Times should be italicized, and it's not. So this writer needs to go back and correct that, and I'll put that in the comments. But I think it's helpful in this instance because we get the name of the author, but we don't know a lot about who this author is. It could be any old author. We do know that this is an author who has written for a publication that's very well respected. Getting the name of the author is also helpful, and letting us know that it is an author is helpful. This writer could have also named this the credential of Alina Tugend as being a journalist. So we know who's talking. We know where this article was originally published, and we get the title of the article. And sometimes it's good to include the title, sometimes it's not. In this instance, the reason that it's a good idea to include the title of the article is because it references that topic idea. So it's letting the reader know, hey, this is an article that is exactly in line with what I'm trying to talk about in this paragraph. So including the title was a good choice here. Another thing I want to point out is that in this sentence, we get just kind of a little mini summary or overview of what Tugin's article is about in general. Sort of like a one-sentence summary of the article. I want you to notice that the student writer takes an entire sentence just to introduce us to this source. Don't rush the process of introducing the source to your audience. Now let's get to the integration part. I've already pointed out that the information from this source is kind of sandwiched in the middle of this paragraph. It's not just plunked down somewhere in the paragraph and left. There's a lot of effort that this writer gives to leading up to the information from the source. So that's kind of the broader way to integrate ideas into your paper. But I also want to look at how this quote is integrated into the writer's sentence. Within this article, the author referenced neuroscience professor Earl Miller, who stated, human brains have a very large prefrontal cortex, which is the part of the brain that contains the executive control process. So what you have is a sentence. It's a mix of a quotation right here and of the student writer's own language and sentence structure. I like this transition. It's letting us know that this writer is getting ready to mention something from the article that was named in the previous sentence. You've got another signal phrase, the author referenced. And then look here. You also have the student writer acknowledging that Tugend was actually quoting neuroscience Earl Miller. This is important. It's another introduction to another source of information, and it gives us the source's credentials. This is a very elegant way of acknowledging that the writer is using information that was cited in this source. Then you've got your verb. And this should actually be a comma instead of a colon, but then you have the direct quote. And this direct quote gives brain science information that relates directly to the whole idea of multitasking and what happens in the brain when multitasking is occurring. So, in this way, the writer has integrated the quoted information into the sentence. And I pointed that out in the comments. This is a wonderful example of how to introduce ideas from one source that originated from another source and are quoted by the author you are referencing. Well done. I also want to point out that we've got an in-text citation there, which is correct. We don't need the author name because it's mentioned here. We do need a page number because this is a hard copy source. Electronic sources, again, do not require page numbers. And that's all that's in the citation. Now, I also want to point out another spot where this writer references information from Tugend again. And I want you to notice that in this reference, the student writer does not use direct quote. That's a really good choice. You don't just want to string quote after quote after quote in your paper. You want to be selective about what you quote and what you paraphrase. And this is a helpful paraphrase because saying that humans are merely shifting focus is a very helpful elaboration on the idea of multitasking. It's kind of a clarification saying we're not really talking about multitasking. We're talking about shifting focus, doing one thing, then doing another thing, not doing two things at the same time. So using original language here was a good choice. One mistake that happened here is that this writer does need to include a citation here as well because this is another reference to an idea from Tugend's article. And that needs to be documented even in the instance of using a paraphrase instead of a direct quote. So these are two very good examples of how to use information from your source in your paper. Now, another thing that I want to point out is that this writer doesn't just drop this information in and leave. The writer goes on to interpret the information from the source. Therefore, the project, that's the project being described up here, takes longer to complete and efficiency is inevitably decreased. Generation Z, so what the writer's doing here is applying this idea to Generation Z. Generation Z has virtually unlimited access to technology, and cell phones have only increased teenagers' desire to multitask as they make the activity more engaging. However, many people do not realize that this entertainment comes at a cost. Focus is lost, and productivity is reduced. So, here, this writer, the student writer, is going to a lot of trouble and effort to help us understand what it is we're supposed to understand and learn from this information from the source. I will say, though, that there are some ways that this needs to be improved upon. We need to understand a little bit more about this whole idea of the prefrontal cortex and the executive control process. I think what the writer is trying to say here is that we have a large prefrontal cortex, and that prefrontal cortex controls the decisions that we make when we move from one task to another, but that's not really explained fully. That needs a little bit more development. Another thing is that this word "this" right here is a reference back to some idea in this previous sentence, but we don't know what it is. So that's another way that this explanation can be even better. So what I wrote was use more concrete language to show what the "this" is here, and then spend a bit more time breaking down the brain science portion of your argument so that your audience understands these terms and why they are important to this discussion. Now, after the writer interprets these ideas and applies them to students, One of the things that I want you to point out is that I want to point out is also effective in this paragraph is that the writer acknowledges the opposing point of view. Conversely, some forms of multitasking can be beneficial. So this is still talking back to and talking about the idea of multitasking, but it's presenting the other side of the coin. And we don't just get a reference. Some forms of multitasking can be beneficial. We don't just get lip service to, that says, hey, somebody who has a different point of view can think what they want to think, but we also get an example. For instance, listening to music while studying for an exam can help a student engaged, and there's a word missing there. Or I think it should say can help keep us, can help keep a student engaged. I just misread it. Again, we've got just a one sentence, crunchy example, concrete example that almost anyone can imagine and connect with. And that helps support the opposing point of view, which demonstrates that this writer really is trying to examine multiple ways to look at this issue. And I put that there in the comments. Good. Here you acknowledge an opposing point of view and even give an example of one way the opposition may be correct. This keeps your presentation balanced and builds trust with your audience. So this is a really successfully overall developed paragraph. Like I said, there are ways that the paragraph can be improved, but it has so much going for it. And I really wanted you to see an example that a current student created and wrote in response to this essay assignment. The last thing that I want to point out is this summary sentence in this paragraph. Multitasking is not inherently harmful, but when it is continually put into practice, the benefits are few and the result is the slow alteration of the brain, that's referencing back to this idea, to fit the mold of technology. So that summary sentence reiterates the topic idea of cellular devices kind of prompting people to practice multitasking, which results in lowered focus and concentration.